The fluorescent lights hum above Sarah Chen's head as she moves through Sacred Heart's ICU on a Tuesday night, her scrubs pressed despite the 14-hour shift waiting ahead. 3 years. 3 years of night shifts, of staying invisible, of being nobody important. Her badge reads Nurse Chen in small white letters, and that's all anyone needs to know. Her left hand trembles slightly as she reaches for the 4-bag in room for 08, muscle memory from Bagram, from the days when trembling meant you were still alive, but she catches herself, steadies the shake with a breath so controlled it sounds like the ventilator beside her patient. The cold steel of the med cart against her palm grounds her. She's good at this, the civilian nursing. She's good at disappearing into it. The antiseptic smell has become her baseline now, replacing the copper and diesel stench of FOB shank. She checks the foredrip with practiced precision, the needle position, the flow rate, the color of the fluid, hands moving like they've been calibrated for this exact work 1,000 times. Because they have. 23 field surgeries in Helmand Province teach you how to keep people alive with nothing but gauze and determination. Civilian hospital equipment feels luxurious by comparison. Sterile. Predictable. Safe. Her locker is waiting when she reaches the break room, and she opens it slowly. The faded unit patch sits there on the top shelf, tucked inside the lining of her old flight jacket, 3rd Special Forces Group, Bagram, the call sign a Valkyrie stitched in black thread that's almost invisible now. She doesn't touch it. She never touches it during shifts. Looking at it through the fabric is enough. Some days it's the only proof that Major Sarah Chen actually existed, that the woman in the pressed scrubs isn't the entire story. She closes the locker without removing it. Invisible things are safer than visible ones. The night shift starts at 2,100 hours. Sarah has timed it. She arrives at 20:45, gets her assignments, reviews the charts before anyone else shows up. The ICU runs on routine, and routine is where she lives now. Room for 08 is stable. Room for 10 is post-op, recovering. Room for 12 has been empty since the afternoon, waiting. She doesn't know this yet. She thinks about the 4-in for 08, about the patient whose daughter visited yesterday and cried because the sepsis numbers were dropping. Small victories. Invisible victories. That's what her therapist called them during the 3 sessions she attended before deciding that talking about Bagram was less effective than not talking about it. Dr. Richard Ashford arrives at the hospital at 2,155 hours, moving through the corridors with the kind of precision that comes from knowing everyone in a building is aware of his importance. His shoes, Italian leather, polished to a shine that catches the overhead lights, click against the tile in a rhythm that sounds like a countdown. His 46, board certified, and in contention for chief of surgery next month, a position that comes with a corner office and a 6-figure salary bump. The hospital board is split. His credentials are impeccable. His complication rates are acceptable. But there's something about him, some quality that makes senior nurses avoid eye contact when he enters a room. He's the kind of doctor who treats medicine like strategy and patients like obstacles to navigate around rather than problems to solve. He stops at the ICU entrance and reviews the admission sheet the night clerk hands him. Room for 12, Colonel Marcus Webb, spinal injury, paralyzed from the T4 vertebra down, 3 weeks post-injury. The file is thick. Ashford opens it, his eye scanning the medical history with the speed of someone who's read 10,000 files exactly like it. Webb's accident report is there, the detailed account of how a roadside IED in Kandahar province detonated under his armored vehicle in 2023. 2 years of recovery. 2 years of rehabilitation that plateaued at severely limited mobility. The spinal imaging shows irreversible damage, calcified at this point. A risky surgical intervention might improve sensation below the injury site, might restore partial motor control, might also paralyze him completely or cause permanent neuropathic pain. Risk versus reward. Ashford has learned to think of medicine this way, as chess moves where the pieces are other people's lives. He moves to the nurse's station, where Sarah Chen is completing a chart with the kind of focus that makes her seem carved from stone. She doesn't look up when he approaches. She's learned this too, the way to acknowledge authority without invitation, which is to appear too occupied to acknowledge it at all. Nurse Chen, Ashford says, and there's something in his voice that makes her look up. Not a question. A summons. Room for 12. I want the chart updated every 2 hours. Standard post-admission protocols only. Nothing more. Sarah holds his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Understood, Doctor. I'm aware Colonel Webb will likely request aggressive intervention, Ashford continues, as if she hasn't spoken. I'm making it clear now that I'm recommending conservative management. Spinal injuries at his level don't respond well to surgical heroics. I trust you'll communicate that clearly to the patient. There's something in the way he says surgical heroics that catches Sarah's attention. The phrase is clinical, professional, but underneath it there's something else, a challenge wrapped in doctrine, a test disguised as an order. She's learned to hear these things. She's learned that some people use authority like a weapon because they're afraid of everything beneath it. I'll ensure he receives complete information, Sarah says carefully, her voice the exact same tone she uses with every other doctor, which is to say neutral, competent, invisible. Ashford's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. That's precisely what I'm trying to prevent, Nurse Chen. Information that leads to unrealistic expectations is a disservice to the patient. He doesn't wait for a response. He never does. He moves to room for 12 to prepare for Webb's arrival, his footsteps fading down the corridor like a threat leaving quietly, which is somehow worse than the loud kind. Sarah doesn't move for 30 seconds. Her hands are perfectly still now. The tremor is completely gone. She's learned to make it disappear when it matters. She picks up the admission file for room for 12 and reads it without letting her breathing change, without letting her chest tighten visibly, without acknowledging the way the name seems to rewrite itself in front of her eyes. Colonel Marcus Webb. The same officer whose name appeared on the court-martial paperwork 3 years ago. The same man who signed the document that ended Major Sarah Chen's military career. The same man whose decision, made in anger, made in a meeting she was never allowed to attend, made from a position of absolute authority that she had no power to question, sent her into this fluorescent quiet where she could pretend to be nobody. She closes the file slowly. Room for 12 isn't empty anymore. It's about to contain the entire reason she left the army and became someone whose name tag says nothing important. 20 minutes later, the elevator announces its arrival with a soft chime, and Sarah watches from the nurse's station as an orderly wheels a tall man in a wheelchair toward room for 12. The man's shoulders are broad, the kind of shoulders that come from decades of military discipline. His legs are still muscular beneath the hospital gown, a detail that somehow makes the wheelchair look more wrong, strength reduced to uselessness by a fraction of a second and half a pound of pressure on a trigger mechanism. The man's face is turned toward the window, and Sarah can't see his expression, can't measure what he might be thinking about this hospital, about his future, about the complications that Ashford mentioned with such clinical precision. But she knows his voice when he speaks to the orderly. "Thank you, son." "Room for 12? "Yes, sir," the orderly responds, and the reflexive respect in his tone tells Sarah that whatever else is broken about Colonel Webb, his presence isn't. She doesn't watch him enter the room. Instead, she updates the chart in room for 10, checks the oxygen saturation on the patient in 408, documents everything with the methodical precision of someone who's learned that small careful actions are how you survive in places that want to break you. But her hand shakes when she reaches for the phone to call Ashford and confirm the admission is complete, and she has to sit down in the break room for exactly 4 minutes before her breathing steadies enough to make the call sound normal. Ashford listens to her report without interrupting, then says only, "Thank you, Nurse Chen." Continue with standard protocols, before hanging up. She sits in the fluorescent white of the break room, the smell of stale coffee and microwaved meals surrounding her, and thinks about the faded unit patch in her locker. The patch has been there for 3 years, waiting. She thinks about what it means that the man who destroyed that uniform, who filed the paperwork that made her invisible, who reduced her from major to nurse with a single signature, is now in room for 12 at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, waiting for a surgery that Dr. Richard Ashford has already decided against. She thinks about what happens when invisible things collide with the past they were designed to escape. The fluorescent lights continue their mechanical humming above her head, and Sarah Chen, who used to be someone else entirely, stands up and returns to work. Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Richard Ashford said to the 4 residents trailing behind him like ducklings, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire ICU corridor to hear. Just a nurse who doesn't understand her limitations. He hadn't even entered room for 12 yet, but Sarah Chen heard every word from where she stood adjusting Colonel Webb's for line, her hand steady as stainless steel, her face betraying nothing. They didn't know she'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife under mortar fire in a province most of them couldn't find on a map. They didn't know that the tremor they might see in her fingers wouldn't be fear, it would be rage, carefully controlled, locked down like a weapon in a safe. But that wasn't the worst part. The morning rounds began like a surgical strike. Dr. Ashford pushed through the door with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape. Webb's adult son and daughter stood beside the bed, her son in a navy baseball cap, her daughter holding a travel mug of coffee. Sarah was finishing a medication check when Ashford positioned himself between her and the family with deliberate precision, his body language cutting her out of the room like an editor removing a scene from a film. The residents crowded in, 3 men and 1 woman, all of them young enough to still believe that credentials guaranteed competence. Nurse Chen, Ashford said, his tone suggesting he was addressing someone who'd just arrived from another planet. Perhaps you'd like to explain to Colonel Webb's family why you felt compelled to question my surgical recommendation yesterday. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. The delayed timeline increases pulmonary embolism risk, Doctor. Standard protocol suggests intervention within 36 hours of admission for incomplete spinal cord injuries with comorbid risk factors. That's what the literature shows. The literature, Ashford repeated, his voice dripping contempt like honey laced with arsenic. He turned to his residents, making sure they were watching. This is exactly the problem with nurses who don't understand their scope. Your limited nursing education can't possibly grasp the surgical complexities involved in a case like this, clipboard. He'd invented the nickname yesterday, clipboard, as if her job was simply to write things down, to exist as furniture in his hospital. The residents smirked like trained seals. Webb's son shifted his weight, discomfort visible in the set of his shoulders. His daughter's jaw tightened. Sarah took 1 measured breath. Just 1. In that single inhale, she felt the weight of every dismissal by men who couldn't see past their own assumptions, the commanders who'd argued against her extraction plan at Bagram, the hospital administrators who'd accepted Ashford's version of events without asking hers, the universe's endless insistence that strength in a woman's voice was insubordination. A single tear escaped before she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. When she spoke, it emerged like a blade drawn from a sheath. Colonel Webb deserves better than your ego, Doctor. The words hung in the air like smoke after detonation. Ashford's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cables. His eyes narrowed. The residents exchanged glances. Webb's children stared at Sarah with something that looked like recognition, the moment when someone stops accepting abuse and starts acknowledging the truth everyone's been too afraid to say. That's quite enough, Ashford said, his voice dropping to the register of a man who's made note of an insult and filed it away for later use. He turned his back to Sarah and continued rounds as if she'd already ceased to exist. The temperature in the room had shifted. Everyone felt it. The air pressure change that occurs when someone crosses a line in a place where lines are supposed to be respected absolutely, hierarchically, without question. Dr. Ashford was the chief of surgery. He controlled schedules, assignments, references, career trajectories. He was the one asking for votes from the hospital board for the chairmanship position he'd been courting for 6 months. And Sarah Chen, night shift ICU nurse, had just openly challenged him in front of his residents and the family of a prominent retired military officer. 2 hours later, Sarah walked into the break room during her lunch break. 3 nurses sat at the corner table: Delia, Marcus, and Keisha, all of them people she'd worked alongside for 3 years without incident. The moment her shadow fell across the doorway, their conversation stopped like someone had hit a mute button. Delia was mid-laugh. Her mouth froze. Marcus looked at his phone. Keisha gathered her things. "See you later," Keisha said, her voice tight with something between sympathy and survival instinct. They left, not walking, actually moving with purpose, their exit time to make clear that proximity to Sarah Chen had just become professionally risky. Sarah opened her lunch container and stared at the rice and vegetables she'd prepared the night before. She couldn't eat. The food looked like it belonged to someone else's body, someone who hadn't just obliterated her career in exchange for a single moment of truth. Her eyes drifted to the unit bulletin board mounted on the break room wall. A formal disciplinary notice had been posted, printed on official hospital letterhead with a signature at the bottom. The handwriting was Ashford's, precise, controlled, lethal in its professionalism. Disciplinary notice. Employee, S. Chen, RN. Date, this morning. Violation, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Details: employee questioned attending physician's clinical judgment in the presence of patient's family members and hospital residents. Employee performed clinical assessment without direct physician orders. Continuing violation of professional boundaries. Action: written warning on file. Further violations may result in probation or termination. Dr. Richard Ashford, Chief of Surgery. The humiliation was public, calculated, and complete. A written warning was the first step. Everyone in the ICU would see it. Everyone would understand that Sarah Chen had been marked. Everyone would know that challenging Dr. Ashford carried consequences. Her hands began to shake. Not from fear, from the effort of keeping everything else still. She opened her lunch container. She closed it. She opened it again. She couldn't remember what she was supposed to be doing. The muscle memory that had served her through 2 tours and 100 crisis moments seemed to have abandoned her in this break room under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects trapped in a cage. The next shift started at 7 p.m. Sarah arrived early, as she always did, checking the assignment board for her unit placements. Her name was gone from the ICU rotation. She was listed instead for the pediatric wing, a unit that didn't need her expertise, a unit where night nurses typically handled rash checks and fever monitoring, a placement that amounted to professional exile. The strategic reassignment was surgical in its precision. Ashford had moved her away from Webb. He'd moved her away from the ICU. He'd moved her somewhere that couldn't possibly challenge his authority or threaten his reputation. The message was clear: move into line, or you'll move out of the game entirely. Sarah stood in front of the assignment board for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been 10 minutes. Time felt negotiable. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down like a physical force, the kind of pressure that existed in her body, in her shoulders, in the tight pull of her stomach. She'd survived combat zones. She'd survived a court-martial. She'd survived the explosion that had ended her military career and left her with shrapnel scars that ran from her shoulder to her hip like the tributaries of some internal river. But this was different. This was the feeling of being caught between who she'd been and who she was allowed to be. This was a man in power using institutional machinery to erase her from a patient's care, knowing that she couldn't fight back without revealing the very thing she'd spent 3 years hiding. She reached into her scrub pocket and felt the outline of the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining back at her apartment, the 3rd Special Forces Group insignia that represented a life she'd buried. Her thumb traced the shape of it through the fabric of her uniform, muscle memory reaching for something the system had already told her she no longer was. The hallway outside the pediatric wing was empty at 7:24 p.m. Sarah pushed through the double doors into a unit that smelled different, sweeter, somehow, with a ghost of vanilla from a diffuser someone had placed near the nursing station. Children slept behind half-closed curtains. Night lights glowed in the shape of stars and moons and cartoon characters whose names she didn't know. The assignment sheet showed her 3 patients. 2 of them were stable. One was a 10-year-old girl recovering from appendectomy, her mother asleep in the reclining chair beside her bed. Sarah checked vitals, documented, prepared medications. Her hands moved on their own, the training asserting itself even when her mind was somewhere else, somewhere back in a room where an old officer lay in a hospital bed and a surgeon had just declared her unfit to help him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, sometime after midnight, when her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. A text from an unknown number: "Thank you for standing up to him. My father told me what you said. He wanted you to know. David Webb." Sarah sat down in an empty patient room and read the message 4 times. Webb's son had gotten her number from somewhere, probably from the hospital directory, probably from a nurse who'd taken pity. He was thanking her. His father had heard her words. In a room where everything had gone wrong, something true had been said, and it had registered. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while she was still trying to breathe through the weight of what she'd done and what was about to happen next. The monitor's shriek split the darkness at 2:36 a.m. like shrapnel through steel. Sarah's head snapped up from the charting station, her body moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory from a life she'd buried 3 years ago. Room for 12. Webb's room. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm while the pulse oximeter screamed a descending wail: 88, 82, 76. His lips had turned the color of a bruise, that telltale blue creeping across the nail beds like frost spreading across winter glass. The other nurses scattered toward the call light, but Sarah was already moving through the pediatric assignment Ashford had imposed like it was a ghost she could pass through. She didn't think. Didn't hesitate. Didn't acknowledge the supervisor who tried to intercept her in the hallway. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining seemed to pulse against her ribs as she pushed through room 412's threshold, her hands already reaching for the emergency tray. Webb's eyes found hers in the darkness, terrified, gasping, drowning on dry land, and something ancient and lethal woke up inside her chest. Pulmonary embolism. The delayed surgery Ashford had orchestrated like a chess move had guaranteed this exact moment. A blood clot had traveled from Webb's paralyzed legs to his lungs, and now his oxygen saturation was collapsing at the rate of a failing structure. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. It was a command, the kind that came from someone who'd issued orders under Taliban fire. A resident froze. Sarah didn't wait. She found the needle herself, her scarred hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed field medicine in a mountain valley while bullets screamed overhead. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She'd done this before in a burning aid station at Bagram with nothing but a combat knife and morphine that was running out. The hospital had sterile equipment, proper lighting, trained staff. This should have been easier. It wasn't. Easier meant there was room for hesitation, and hesitation killed people. The needle slid through skin and muscle, through the parietal pleura. The hiss of air escaping sounded like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. Immediately, oxygen saturation began its climb. 68, 72. 79, Webb's body relaxed into the mattress like a man pulled from the water who finally believed he wouldn't drown. The blue receded from his lips. His breathing deepened. Normal sinus rhythm reasserted itself on the monitor like a metronome re-establishing order after chaos. Nurses crowded the doorway now, watching in stunned silence. The supervisor was speaking into her radio. Everything had taken 4 minutes. Maybe 5. Time collapsed differently when lives hung in the balance. Sarah stepped back from the bed, her hand still steady as she disposed of the needle, already moving into documentation mode. The chart needed updating. Webb's vitals needed recording. The emergency decompression would need to be flagged for Ashford's morning review. She was thinking through the clinical next steps when she felt it, that particular species of silence that precedes catastrophe. The hallway had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their perpetual electronic song. Ashford appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his face arranged in an expression of surgical concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. His gaze swept across Webb's stabilized form, across the documentation already written in meticulous detail, across Sarah standing at the vital signs monitor with her shoulders squared and her breathing even. He was seeing what he wanted to see, a threat. A nurse who had exceeded her scope of practice. A woman who had stepped beyond the boundaries he had carefully drawn, using medicine as her weapon instead of her armor. His jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but Sarah caught it the way a predator catches the scent of blood on the wind. "Dr. Chen," he said, and even through the professional veneer she heard the grinding of teeth beneath the courtesy. He never called her Sarah. "I see you've made your way back to your assigned unit." She didn't look at him. The eyes were always where the threat lived. Colonel Webb's O2 saturation was 68. Dropping. Her voice remained measured, clinical. Emergency needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Unauthorized procedure, Ashford said. The words fell like stones into still water. Without physician order. Without consultation. In direct violation of the reassignment protocol I implemented this afternoon. His lungs were failing, Sarah said. Still not looking at him. Still watching Webb's monitor, watching the numbers stay where they needed to be. Another 3 minutes and he would have been in cardiac arrest. Ashford moved to the bedside, his movements precise and controlled, a man used to owning every room he entered. He examined Webb's chest, noting the needle mark, the documentation of fluid released, the immediate improvement in oxygenation that no one in the hospital could dispute. He was competent enough to understand exactly what had happened and skilled enough to know that arguing against the clinical outcome would make him look like a fool. So instead, he was calculating. Reassessing. His eyes moved from Webb to Sarah, and in that moment she saw the shift happen behind his pupils, from anger to something far more dangerous. Strategy. He had just promoted her from nuisance to existential threat. "You performed a procedure outside your scope as a nurse," he said quietly. The voice was the worst kind of dangerous, reasonable. Measured. The voice of a man who already knew exactly how the next conversation would go. In direct violation of hospital protocol. Without physician supervision or authorization. In a patient you were not assigned to. He paused, letting each violation settle into the air like sediment. And you did it while under formal reassignment, which means you deliberately ignored a direct administrative order. Sarah finally looked at him. Just a glance. Her expression didn't change. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the compressed energy of someone who understood exactly how close to the surface her other life lived, how thin the membrane between nurse and soldier had always been. He needed help, she said. That's not your determination to make. Ashford's voice had taken on the sharp edge of a scalpel. I'm the attending physician on this patient. His care decisions are mine. Your job is to follow orders, not rewrite them because you disagree with my clinical judgment. He turned to address the nurses still hovering in the doorway. I'll be writing a formal incident report. This is being escalated to patient safety and the nursing board. Effective immediately, Nurse Chen is suspended pending investigation. The words landed in the room like a grenade with the pin already pulled. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah had seen this coming from the moment she stepped into room for 12. Ashford wasn't reacting. He was executing. The suspension was just the beginning, the first move in a sequence he'd already choreographed. He'd placed her in pediatrics to isolate her. He denied her access to Webb's chart to ensure she couldn't help. He'd timed his words to fall right after she'd proven her clinical competence beyond any shadow of doubt, so that when he suspended her, the hypocrisy would be baked into the narrative. A doctor punishing a nurse for saving a life. A man protecting his authority by destroying hers. Security arrived within the hour, a young man whose name tag read Martinez, whose eyes wouldn't quite meet hers as he walked her to the locker room. The gesture was apologetic, which meant he understood what was happening. Which meant Ashford had already made calls to ensure cooperation. Sarah changed out of her scrubs with mechanical efficiency, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind remained absolutely still. The uniform came off. The professional identity was stripped away. She was left with jeans and a t-shirt and the faded unit patch that fell from her locker as she was closing the door. She picked it up. Stared at it. The 3rd Special Forces Group insignia was worn almost transparent from years of being hidden, from being carried against her chest, from being the only thing she'd brought from Bagram besides scars. Ashford didn't know what it meant. The hospital didn't know what it meant. Webb knew. He'd signed the paperwork that buried her career, that transformed her from major to nothing, that forced her to choose between military honor and civilian survival. And now he was watching her burn for saving his life. The parking garage fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal electronic lament as she sat in her car with the engine dead and her head pressed against the steering wheel. 2 hours. That's how long she stayed there, unmoving, trapped in the space between the soldier she'd been and the nurse she'd tried to become. The formal ethics review notice arrived on her phone at 4:33 a.m., mandatory hearing in 72 hours. Patient Safety Board. Nursing License Review. Potential termination. The words were clinical and precise and they read like a death sentence for the second identity she'd tried to build. First Bagram had taken her future. Now Sacred Heart was taking what was left. She sat in the darkness with the unit patch pressed against her ribs and waited for morning to arrive, already knowing that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Ashford had moved from humiliation to strategy to sabotage in less than 48 hours. He'd suspended her. He'd pulled her access. He'd triggered a formal investigation that would scrutinize every decision she'd made, every note she'd written, every moment of her nursing career with the precision of a weapons inspection. What he didn't know, what he could never have anticipated, was that he'd just made his first critical error. He'd cornered a woman who had nothing left to lose. A major in the United States Army didn't just vanish when she was pushed. She waited. She observed. She prepared. And when the moment came, she didn't negotiate with the man who'd tried to bury her. She buried him first. By morning, Ashford had moved with surgical precision. Sarah arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:24 a.m. to find the pediatric wing assignment posted on the employee portal, effective immediately. Her name removed from the ICU roster. Her name removed from every veteran case scheduled for the next 6 months. The reassignment was professional. Clinical. Devastating. But that wasn't the worst part. By 8 a.m., Ashford had made his calls. The hospital board chairman received a message about the nurse with boundary issues and a pattern of overstepping her scope of practice. The chief nursing officer got a formal memo citing Sarah's unauthorized clinical decisions and insubordination toward physician authority. The surgical committee heard that Sarah had interfered with established protocols, though Ashford never specified which ones. He didn't have to. A suggestion was enough. A few carefully chosen words to the right people, and a reputation could calcify like scar tissue. Sarah sat in her car in the parking garage for 2 hours. Engine dead. Head pressed against the steering wheel. Rain hammered the windshield like automatic weapons fire, and she couldn't remember why she'd thought she could be anything other than a soldier. 23 years in combat zones where decisions were made in milliseconds and the consequences were counted in body bags. 3 years trying to be civilian. 3 years of scrubs instead of fatigues, stethoscope instead of rifle, and still, the moment it mattered, she'd made a choice a soldier would make. She'd saved the life in front of her and accepted the cost without flinching. The cost had a name now. It was termination papers. They arrived at noon on a Thursday, delivered by hand to her home address before she'd even left the parking garage. Gross insubordination. Violation of suspension terms. Unauthorized patient contact. The language was precise, clinical, final. Sacred Heart was pursuing immediate revocation of her privileges pending a full ethics investigation. The state board would be notified. References would reflect the termination for cause. Ashford had already called his contacts at the State Nursing Board. She would learn this later, suggesting that Major Sarah Chen's judgment was fundamentally compromised and her fitness to practice should be questioned. The calls were informal, collegial. Just a concerned physician wanting to ensure public safety. The poison was in the framing, the implication that something was wrong with her mind, her decision-making, her ability to distinguish right from wrong. What Ashford didn't know was that his poison had a different effect on Sarah. It didn't paralyze her. It clarified her. By Friday afternoon, a sympathetic ICU nurse, one of the few who hadn't scattered when Sarah sat down in the break room, found her sitting in her car again. Same garage. Same rain, harder now. The nurse's name was Marcus, and he'd worked the night shift. His face was tight with urgency. Web sepsis markers are rising, Marcus said without preamble. He handed her a printed lab report, his hand shaking slightly. WBC 18,000. Lactate 3.2. Creatinine climbing. His fever spiking every 4 hours. Sarah's breath caught. She knew what those numbers meant. She knew what they signified if Ashford continued his current timeline. When surgery scheduled, she asked, though she already knew the answer. Postponed, Marcus said. His voice dropped. Ashford cited protocol concerns. He moved it another 48 hours. Sarah, he's delaying intentionally. I've seen it before, he's covering liability. Letting Webb decline so he can justify the original surgical timeline. The rain hammered. Marcus waited. He's not protecting the patient, Sarah said quietly. He's protecting himself. I know. Marcus stepped closer, lowered his voice even though they were alone in an empty garage. Your badge hasn't been deactivated yet. Security hasn't sent the revocation notice through the system. Administrative lag. You could still get into the building through the ER entrance, the badge readers don't flag until the morning update. Sarah understood what he was offering. Not just information. Opportunity. A choice. If you do this, Marcus continued, Ashford will know. He'll come after you harder. He's already burning everything, Sarah said. The rain kept falling. At least this way, something burns for a reason. That night at 11 p.m., Sarah used her still-active badge. The ER entrance didn't flag her? Security didn't stop her? She moved through the corridors with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, muscle memory taking over, body remembering protocols older than her civilian identity. Room for 12 was quiet. Monitors beeping their steady rhythm. Webb was barely conscious, fevering at 103.7 degrees, sweat-soaked and struggling to breathe against his paralysis. Webb's son was asleep in the chair beside the bed. Sarah didn't wake him. She reviewed the chart with hands steady as surgical lasers. Ashford's notes detailed the postponed surgery, the protocol concerns, the timeline pushed back 48 hours. Sarah knew exactly what would happen in 48 hours. Webb's infection would spread. His organs would begin to fail. The surgery Ashford had deemed unnecessary would become an emergency intervention with a mortality rate climbing with each passing hour. She paged the on-call surgeon directly. No intermediary. No Ashford. Just a simple message, Colonel Webb, room for 12. Sepsis markers rising. Deterioration from baseline. Emergency surgical consultation needed immediately. The surgeon arrived at 12:17 a.m. He reviewed Webb for 14 minutes. He looked at Sarah once, really looked at her, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what was happening and why. He didn't ask questions. He rushed Webb to the OR within 20 minutes. Sarah stayed until Webb was stable post-op at 2:41 a.m., then slipped out of the hospital using the same ER entrance, badge still working, security still silent. She should have known Ashford would discover what happened by morning. His fury was the cold kind, the worst kind. Not rage. Strategy. Calculation. By noon, termination papers landed on her doorstep again, updated and refined. This version included gross violation of suspension terms, unauthorized patient contact, and pattern of insubordination with potential criminal liability regarding unauthorized medical intervention. Ashford made his calls again. This time to the hospital's legal department, to his allies on the board, to his contact at the state board. By Friday, Sarah's nursing license was formally under investigation for fitness to practice. The ethics hearing was scheduled for Monday at 2 p.m. A formality, everyone knew, for her complete dismissal. But what happened next changed everything. The hospital's mandatory ethics review convened at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the conference room smelled like stale coffee and institutional panic. Administrators lined one side of the polished table. Board members occupied the other. Legal counsel sat at the head, briefcase unopened, expression neutral. Dr. Ashford arrived 15 minutes early, his white coat pressed with knife-edge precision, his expression carefully constructed into concerned authority, the face of a man wronged by an overzealous nurse, the face of a physician forced to defend himself against insubordination. He'd practiced it in the mirror. It was almost convincing. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge. Someone had cracked a window. October rain hammered the glass like it wanted in. Sarah sat alone on the opposite side, no union representative, no advocate. Just her scrubs and her collected composure. She'd worn the jacket with the faded patch still sewn inside the lining, her armor invisible to everyone but herself. The hospital's chief administrator, a woman named Patricia Voss, adjusted her glasses and pulled the first document from a folder marked Chen's disciplinary record. The room held its breath. And then the doors swung open. Colonel Marcus Webb rolled through in a wheelchair, his son pushing him, both moving with the absolute certainty of soldiers who'd learned that hesitation gets people killed. The son was 31, maybe 32, with his father's eyes and his father's spine. Webb's hands trembled slightly on the wheelchair arms, nerve damage from the paralysis, but his jaw was set like granite. He wore a jacket despite the warmth of the room. A choice that meant something. A choice that mattered. Colonel Webb, Patricia Voss began, confusion blooming across her face. This is a closed disciplinary hearing. You're not scheduled to. The son stepped forward. Major Sarah Chen, he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone raised on his father's stories. Each word was pronounced with precision. Respect. I'm James Webb. My father wanted you to know something before they finished destroying you. Sarah's eyes found Webb's, and something shifted in the room. The air pressure changed. This was no longer a casual ethics review. This was something else entirely. Webb's hands moved toward his jacket zipper with the slow deliberation of someone fighting through pain. His breathing quickened, the physical cost of that small movement visible across his face. His son moved to help, but Webb shook his head once. Sharp. Military. I've got this. The zipper came down. Webb pulled his jacket open, revealing a faded 3rd Special Forces group patch sewn into the interior lining with meticulous stitching. The colors had dulled over years. Decades, maybe. But the insignia was unmistakable. 75th Ranger Regiment. Special Operations Command. The patch of men who'd operated in places that didn't appear on maps. Webb's trembling hand pointed towards Sarah's shoulder. Show them, he whispered, his voice like sandpaper on concrete, like someone who'd forgotten how to speak without screaming underneath it. Sarah stood. The room watched. She reached down slowly, deliberately, and rolled up her right sleeve. The fluorescent lights caught the ink above the shrapnel scars, the puckered, white-edged wounds that mapped a mortar attack from Bagram. The scars formed a landscape. The tattoo above them was intricate, precise, rendered in black and grey by an artist who understood what symbols meant. Unit insignia. Call sign. Coordinates that would mean nothing to civilians but everything to soldiers. Valkyrie. 3rd Special Forces Group. The date of the Bagram operation, 2019. Webb's son opened the medical file with hands that shook, not from weakness but from restrained emotion. His voice broke once before he continued reading. Major Sarah Chen, he said, U.S. Army Special Forces. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Court-martialed for disobeying direct orders during Operation Kestrel, Helmand Province, 2019. He paused. Drew breath. She disobeyed orders to extract 12 Afghan civilians caught in crossfire during a Taliban ambush. She was the only one who could reach them. She was the only one who did. His eyes found Ashford. The officer who ordered her retreat and court-martialed her for refusing stands in this room right now. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the rain drumming against the windows like accusations. Patricia Voss's pen stopped mid-note. Her eye shifted to Ashford, then back to Sarah. Back to the tattoo. Back to the scar tissue that told a story in a language she suddenly understood. That was not an insubordination, Webb's son continued, reading from the file. That was heroism. My father has regretted his decision to court-martial Major Chen every single day since Bagram. Every single day. He requested her discharge and immediate reinstatement of her service record with honors. He spent 3 years trying to find her to apologize. He looked at his father. Webb's eyes were closed, jaw working silently. She saved his life twice. Once in 2019. Once last week when she performed an emergency needle decompression that your chief of surgery refused to authorize. A lawyer at the table, a woman in a sharp grey suit, leaned over to Patricia and whispered something. Patricia nodded slowly. She opened her laptop and turned the screen slightly so everyone could see. Security footage, she said quietly. From last Tuesday night. The ER. The moment of Major Chen's procedure. The video played in silence. Sarah's hands moving with terrifying fluid precision. The needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping the tension pneumothorax. Webb's oxygen saturation climbing, 72. 79, 86. 91, sinus rhythm. Stable. Breathing. Living. That's incredible skill, Patricia said. That's not protocol violation. That's field medicine under pressure. She closed the laptop and looked directly at Ashford. Where did you learn that, Major Chen? Sarah's eyes were steel. Bagram. 2016 to 2019. Patricia turned back to her legal counsel. Pull the communications, she ordered. The lawyer nodded, already typing. 30 seconds passed. Then, here. Email chain, March 14, Dr. Ashford to board members, recommend surgical delay pending administrative review. Controversy with veteran case could impact board dynamics. March 15, recommend against aggressive intervention. Paralysis patient. High liability. The lawyer looked up. He deliberately delayed surgical intervention based on liability concerns, not medical necessity. Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to something colder. More final. Where's the evidence of the procedure recording deletion? The hospital's IT director, a man named Captain Mark Holloway, 30-year Marine veteran, 2 deployments, the kind of calm that comes from already having survived the worst, stepped forward with his laptop. Dr. Ashford logged into the security system on March 17 at 23:33. He attempted to delete the ER footage from the date of Major Chen's emergency intervention. The deletion was incomplete due to our redundant backup system, but the attempt itself is logged and documented. Holloway projected the screen. He also searched his email account for keywords including a delay, liability, veteran, and controversy. The search history is recoverable. Ashford's face had gone the color of hospital walls. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. This is a witch hunt, he said, and his voice had lost its careful control. It cracked like thin ice. That nurse violated protocol. She exceeded her scope of practice. She She saved a man's life that you were willing to let die, Patricia said flatly. We're done here. The board members exchanged looks. The lawyer made a note. Voss stood. The meeting was over. Not in the way Ashford had imagined. Not with Sarah's credentials revoked and her career erased. But with his own suspended indefinitely, pending investigation from the State Medical Board, pending review of his entire surgical record, pending the very legal scrutiny he'd tried to avoid by delaying Webb's care in the first place. Ashford stood too. You don't understand, he said, addressing the room. I was protecting this hospital. Her actions were the actions of a trained combat medic saving a patient, Patricia interrupted. Not a nurse. A major. In the United States Army Special Forces. Everything you've done, the reassignments, the documentation, the deletion attempts, the deliberate delay of care, all of it was directed at a woman far more qualified than you've ever been to make medical decisions under pressure. She gestured toward the door. Your access credentials are being revoked effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The humiliation of it was complete. Not a drawn-out destruction but an instant, total collapse. Ashford's strategic competence had been demolished by the very documentation he'd carefully filed. His allies on the board suddenly found urgent other commitments. His careful phone calls meant nothing against a woman with a purple heart and a tattoo that told the truth his lies couldn't cover. 6 months later, the walls of Sarah's office at Sacred Heart overlooked the ICU where everything had changed. The nameplate on her door read, Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of Emergency Medicine. She'd completed an accelerated physician's program on a full military scholarship, her path finally opening once her real identity emerged, once the hospital realized they'd been employing a major in a nurse's uniform. The walls held her credentials, her certifications, and 2 frames side by side. One held Webb's faded unit patch from the 3rd Special Forces Group. The other held her Bronze Star with Valor, the citation carefully preserved in acid-free glass. She stood at her window as rain fell softly against the glass, rain that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of something. The night shift nurses passed below, moving through the ICU with the quiet certainty of people who save lives in the dark. One of them looked up and waved. Sarah waved back. The intercom crackled, trauma incoming. Multi-vehicle MVA. ETA for minutes. Sarah grabbed her white coat, the one with Dr. Chen embroidered in blue thread, and headed for the door. As she passed the security desk on the way down, she saw a guard she didn't recognize in an ill-fitting uniform pushing a supply cart, his eyes deliberately averted. She didn't slow down. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you found yourself holding your breath during this story, I want you to comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Sarah's position? And please, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week, we're telling the story of a teacher everyone underestimated until the very moment she needed her hidden past. You won't want to miss it.